eventually just have to move on, you know? Even though that seems like that's just the way open source is supposed to work. We took your project, we saw a flaw, we 100, shallow bugs and 100 eyeballs and all that, and we fixed it for you, and no response. So that's another side of it.
I'll tell you, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. I felt like you were reading my soul when you made that comment. Hi, welcome to the G-Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. That's where we gross you out with the real details of working on and running open source and all that entails. And, we'd just like to say thank you for everyone who's been following us, who's been listening to the podcast on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. Again, if you can subscribe, leave a review, hit that like button, you're going to help us out a whole lot. But today, I've got someone else here helping me out a whole lot, who is someone who I've worked with the whole time I've been here at G-Research. We've had some interesting conversations in the past. Tim Boudreau is here with us today. And Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, just what you do here at GR-OSS, and if you're known as anything other than Tim Boudreau in open source communities, let people know, sort of your persona in the world here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm surprised and delighted that you invited me. I have a very low profile in the open source world. In fact, I spent about 30 years writing software on just about every system you can name. Not a lot of Windows, but everything else. And almost none of it has been open source. But I joined the open source group at G-Research. I was a charter member, I think. There were just a few of us, and G-Research was a company that was quite insular and built most of its own tech, both infra and ML, and right up the whole stack. And so we've been introducing, over the past couple of years, the ethos of open source to G-Research, and the team has been growing and growing. I do most of my work in machine learning tooling at G-Research and in my career immediately before G-Research. Currently, we're involved in a partnership with NVIDIA, and they are working very diligently on a framework called Legate, which is based on some research that came out of Stanford called Legion. That is a framework and set of libraries and budding ecosystem for simplifying the development of distributed accelerated computing software.
Yeah, we're going to dig into that a little bit later. I'm a hardware guy at heart, so all that sounds really interesting to me. It's I do want to start with I feel like in some ways this podcast, the people we have speaking here are sort of the faces of GR-OSS, but we definitely want to take time and recognize folks like you who help pioneer. It's not very often that a company in such a sensitive field as quant finance is willing to be open about some of the tooling they use, some of the infrastructure they use, and your influence as one of the early members is seen in that. And so we appreciate that a lot. And we actually were talking to Mark Burnett a little while ago about the various ways that benefits G-Research. So if someone's listening to this and they went, gosh, I wish my company knew that, then let's go listen. Me and Mark Burnett talked a little bit about how to solve that. But I'm actually really curious about the NVIDIA software and stuff. But I do want to ask a specific question first. You said your original experience was mostly in, working on commercial software products or things that were generally, with a lid on it instead of being so open. Has there been anything that you've had to adjust as a software developer over that time to sort of integrate with open source communities? Are there any skills that you learned working inside of that corporate environment that carried over to open source?
Yeah, the thing you don't realize when you're writing proprietary software is that you can keep experimenting on your own the whole time. So all software starts with an experimentation phase, and you're working out the ideas in code if you're building a project of any size, of any scope. And then it reaches a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to start to productionize this and make it useful. And it's a very gray area between when you're still in control and can change anything at any time. In open source, there's sort of a brighter line. You could work on your idea for a while, but as soon as it goes up on GitHub, and you try to build a community, it's all exposed, So that's, as I said, for me, that was a bit of a shock. But every community is different. So some communities are extremely welcoming. Um, Others are, well, just say cool in the philosophical sense. They're cooler. Um, and yeah, just if anything, I think maybe it's about developing a thicker skin. So probably if I had grown up in the open source world, it wouldn't even be a concern for me. But I'm sure there are lots of folks out there who spent their entire lives at research institutions or large companies, and yeah, they're thinking, well, we'll have some trepidation about making an open source contribution or even starting an open source project. I would suggest not to worry about that. Just get out there and see what happens. You know,
I'm
join
really
the
glad
altruistic movement.
that you're highlighting this because every single new person I talk about who works on open source this is something that sort of trips them up is, their code's out there, maybe they get feedback that's tough to hear, or even just basic feedback. It doesn't feel quite the same as if it was from someone sitting in a desk next to you or who you've been working with for a while. And it definitely requires an attitude change. I have always tried, and try is the operative word here. Like, I've gotten code reviews that made me feel bad, not necessarily from like a confidence standpoint, but from a, oh no, I have to redo this standpoint. But
Yeah.
I always try to remember that it's a nice thing that someone cared enough about my software to go look at it and to
Yeah.
comment on it and to make that. And even if I disagree with their take or whatever, they cared enough to go read that. And that's a heck of a lot better than, I've had those same jobs working on proprietary software, maybe not as a developer, but as an operator. And it can kind of feel a little bit bad if you're stamping out the same thing that 100 other people have done, just, in a different color than everyone else. And so having something that's truly unique that people are interested in is really awesome. Is
Yeah.
there like is there maybe an experience from like the corporate world that's maybe uncommon that you might would equate to like that sort of being out in the open in the public?
Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say this. You're, there's always people who I agree with you, by the way. It's much nicer to get feedback from people when there's a broader bandwidth, where there's a more context. Um, and that's easier to get in the corporate world. One of the earliest experiences I had when I first was dipping my toe into open source was I was working on the Parquet project, and we made a contribution that had to do with the metadata. As you know, Parquet is a specification, but there were quite a few different implementations, um, and it went fine. I probably over-engineered it. It is what it is. Um, I'm wont to do that. Uh, but what doesn't go away, and is very similar to the corporate, to answer your question, very similar to the corporate experience, is there was about a month after my contribution went live, that got merged. A set of problems arose with one of the implementations, a Java-based implementation. I was working on the C++ implementation, and it wasn't an obvious blunder. It was just there were two implementations that were interpreting a gray area of the spec slightly different. The details don't matter. All that matters is that same sense of panic and that same sense of, oh my God, what have I done wrong? That you had that you have in any proprietary set, whether you're in DevOps or whatever you're doing, it still exists. You have ownership of your thing going forward. So that doesn't change. In fact, what's probably softens the blow in a manner of looking at it is that there are 3 or 4 other people, at least, on the project who care at least as much as you that it gets fixed. And most of them, especially if you're a new contributor, are going to do it more quickly and understand exactly what's going on. And that's a sort of a safety net that doesn't exist. If you're the lead architect, many times the lead architect, the chief bottle washer on the product that I've worked on. So there's no one else to figure out what's going on if something's going badly. So community is, works both ways. It can be feel a little distant, as you mentioned, but it also can be a sense of a place where you can rely on other people who have similar motivations, motivations that are aligned. I would say this, though, the thing that was most stinging to me about when making open source contributions were the times when there was just absolute rejection. And I don't mean the worst kind of rejection is we barely even looked at your code. So this is what you were alluding to. I had at least two experiences where I was working on, I won't mention the project, but they're machine learning tool that you've heard of and the serialization mechanism, the tooling that you've heard of. And I was closing a hole in their offering. And I did a professional job, in my humble opinion, about putting the code together and putting up PR. And in one case, it was like the most curt rejection. This isn't something we want, deny. And in the other case, it was just no response at all. Despite the number of thumbs up and everything the PR got, no response at all from the maintainers. So eventually you just have to move on, even though that seems like that's just the way open source is supposed to work. We took your project, we saw a flaw, we 100, shallow bugs and 100 eyeballs and all that, and we fixed it for you, and no response. So that's another side of it.
I'll tell you, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. I felt like you were reading my soul when you made that comment about like getting that overwhelming sense of like, I hope I don't break this for everyone, or I hope I didn't break it for everyone. Is especially I have a background in operations, so like the shape of that in my mind is always I woke up Bob, or I woke up Sally, or whoever was on the other end of that call. Or honestly, when I'm the security liaison up at Ironic, so a lot of times I'm the one triaging bugs coming in. I do a lot of the communication, and people try to give you pats on the back, and you're like, well, I've been in this project for 10 years. I'm probably a non-zero part of the reason this person's going to have to patch. So like it has like these weird effects. But going to that second bit about when you're just sort of rejected out of hand, I've always tried, and I kind of advise people to do this, but it's very tough when it's a core thing like a serialization library that probably you don't get much choice over, to like approach the project, file an issue, maybe even we've had good success putting like a small pilot issue, like where we're going to fix the most minor bug. It takes a couple hours, and just see, do they look at the pull request? Are they friendly? Are they nice? And then that's almost like a litmus test for if we continue. And there have been multiple situations that I've seen where we've gone through this process. We've seen that a maintainer is absent, or at least huge amounts of latency. And then later, G Research has had a hand in helping to revive those projects back into maintenance. So open source, sometimes you get a rejection, but sometimes when you're ignored, it's just you got to play the long game a little bit. And that's not always easy when you are actively experiencing a bug that someone could click 2 buttons to fix.
Yeah.
But it's I always try to make up a reason in my head, like, oh, this person must be dealing with something terrible if they can't approve this PR very small, and just make up whatever story I have to not imagine the worst about my code and myself when it gets rejected.
Yeah, but you touched on something important, which is that, humans are humans. And so getting buy-in on things, this is like an old corporate skill, float the idea, run it up the flagpole. We've all heard these cliches, but it's not my idiom, my default mode to like talk about things long before I code them. I think in code and I do the code, and then here's my code. You like my idea. But you're right. Do an issue. Get buy-in. See if you're going to get a response. Sometimes you go down the path you mentioned, which is that you find out product needs a maintainer. And other times you find out that they're just not going to go in that direction, and don't waste 2 weeks that it takes you to put the PR together and do the testing and all the thinking and so forth. So some skills are transferable.
And it's a situation where like I feel like I've been on both sides of that coin, and it feels pretty bad from either side, because, for instance, someone proposes a change to Ironic and they just want to like add a field to the API. It's probably a 50-line change. It's not going to break anything. But what someone who's been working on a project for a while, who's a core, might be thinking that you aren't, is I have to maintain this forever. You can still call Ironic's API with the same parameters you did 10 years ago and get the same results you did 10 years ago. And every little bit is up. So it's like, I don't even want this discussion to come off like we're like, those darn maintainers, they don't want to land our code. No, it's not even about that.
Yeah.
It is definitely, the buy-in is the perfect thing. And like, if you're a more open sourcer, you're not as well versed in corpo speak as Tim and I have. We've done our rounds, I'm sure, it's it's one of those things where you want people to understand why you're making the change. You want to understand what's the usefulness of the change. And you want
Yeah.
them to be thinking before you even propose the change, gosh, it'd be nice if someone wrote that. And
Yeah.
if you
Yes.
can get them to that point, then it can turn the PR process from something that might have been adversarial if you come code first or
Yeah.
idea first, rather than
Yeah.
a collaborative thing that can happen if you come idea first or maybe even problem first and try to solve it in the community.
100%. I endorse 100%. Yeah.
So, speaking of that sort of thing, there's definitely a big community push around hardware, fancy hardware, beefy hardware. I've actually been really eager to see with NVIDIA getting a hold of the ARM patents and, ARM company and the GPUs they're providing to, help with machine learning AI use cases. That's always been really exciting to me to sort of see what's around the corner, because that's a very innovative hardware company and they kind of have done new and cool things. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about this window you've opened, this new library you're working on to give people access to all this beefy computing power?
Um, yeah, I mean, so the project is called Leagate, and it's, as I said, mentioned earlier, was born at Stanford. And the gap they saw was, especially in researchers who were taking most, let's talk about a high performance computing community, was taking at in the early stages of GPU acceleration, the GPU movement, were taking advantage of this acceleration possibility. But there was a gap. And the gap was we have scientists who have an idea and maybe have some Python. And on the other hand, we have hardware and we have C++ programmers who know CUDA. And they have to communicate. It takes forever to go from ideation to production. So I think that was the original motivation for the project. But it's grown since then to, more than just financial companies and CERN are using hardware acceleration. And that means that there are many more. And by the way, Python is moving with NVIDIA's help. They're trying to make Python a first-class language for GPU programming. As a stated goal. So now there's just going to be an explosion of hardware on the one side and idea makers on the other. And so they're positioning Leagate, I think, to sit in that space. Another axis on this problem is that we have, or this landscape, let's say, is that for example, we have data frames, we had pandas. It was a sea change in the way you did things when pandas came on. Now we have polars. Polars takes advantage of multiple CPU, that type of thing. We don't quite have distributed polars. Leagate will have Leagate data frame. Right now, it's sort of, I don't want to say it's in its infancy, but it's in its early days. But it will be natively distributed and GPU accelerated. So, that's the niche they're trying to fill. They're making a long-term commitment to it. And one of the many tentacles that G Research has out in the open source community is to set up partnerships with hardware companies and other software companies and open source communities, and to try to provide financial assistance when necessary, but also just we're pre-alpha users. We're the earliest of early adopters on this platform.
This is actually really interesting to me because this is I had no idea that we're sort of two parts of like a binary system, right? Because I'm the infrastructure guy. I help them stamp computers out, or at least I write the software that runs the machines that stamps the computers out. And they've got other smart people actually running it every day. And you are helping out on the recipient side of that, which is pretty fun.
Mhm.
Can you spell Leagate for us though, just in case anyone's listening at home and they don't know what you're talking about?
Of course, Leagate.
Okay, so Leagate, and we're going to have a link to that as well as any other specific technologies or company, anything interesting we talk about, be down in the description or in the description section of your podcast app. So
Mhm.
just have an awareness of that. So, I'm a person who has spent his career provisioning things like CPUs and GPUs, not a lot with like using them. So, can we maybe dig, we don't even have to get deep in the woods here, but like, what sort of interface would something like Leagate provide? Like, what are the tools in that toolbox that you would describe it, elevator pitch to someone who's maybe never accelerated something on a GPU before?
So I would say that there'll be two levels of interface. One for the what I believe to be the original uh, target of the platform, developers like me who have written CUDA code and now would have ideas about how to write distributed systems, but don't want to write the entire stack. So here's a framework for doing that. And there's another access point, let's say, which are the libraries that are appearing. So there's as I mentioned earlier, a bit of a budding ecosystem. There's Leagate Data Frame, which is sort of the early days. There's Leagate Boost, which is has it's a gradient boosted decision tree platform with other model forms built into it. There's Cupine Numeric, which is, think of it like NumPy uh, accelerated and distributed. And there's those are some of the main ones that like a machine learning analyst would be interested in. They're in various stages of maturity. Cupine Numeric is basically usable right now, and the others are sort of intermediate. So that's the ecosystem that's developing.
Does this use I know that that CUDA, what used to be sort of the standard for this thing, is this, where does this stand in relation to, if someone out there is like, I know CUDA, does Leagate use that? How do those relate?
Um, yes, if you know, so Leagate provides a C++, uh, direct C++, not an extended C++ like CUDA interface, and also a Python interface. So if you're a Python programmer, you can use like Leagate directly. You just as if you were a Python programmer, you can use Arrow directly. You have to uh, understand the concepts, buffers and arrays and so forth in Arrow. And there's logical stores and physical stores in Leagate. But once you've got the concepts, as a Python programmer, you can program Leagate. And you could build a library that was at the same level in the stack as Leagate Boost, for example.
Okay, and this is completely an NVIDIA specific thing. It's not going to work on, if you've got an AMD GPU or one of the other companies.
For now, I'm it's very focused on NVIDIA GPUs. I don't think there's anything architecturally that prevents it from working on
I mean,
AMD.
it definitely makes sense. NVIDIA has a pretty iron grip on the enterprise GPU space these days.
Mhm.
But when we have folks on the podcast, we sometimes like to talk about stuff that's not always pretty, that doesn't always have a clean thing there, because we've been in the industry a long time. Almost nothing that we do is going to be a straight line from A to B. And if someone's out there listening and they feel a little stuck, do you maybe have a story about a gross moment in open source for you that y'all are able to figure out and overcome? And I would say, like, you have so much experience outside of open source. We just finished talking about the parallels. Even if you've got a good story from behind closed doors somewhere, we'll change the names to protect the innocent if needed, or the
Um,
guilty, however it may go around.
yeah, I mentioned my biggest panic moment was related to Parquet. That was like the biggest panic moment I've ever had. Surprisingly, at G Research, despite the long absence of an open source like mindset, they've been extremely forthcoming. I think you probably have this experience as well. Yeah, I would say that I'm afraid I already gave my story, which is that I had a moment of panic when I first started a journey to open source. Now it's a blip. I had to think hard about how panicked I was at the time. Should probably stop using that word because that's not exactly the feeling, but I think every developer knows the feeling and how much of a blip it turns out to be in the long run. So,
You get the scenarios playing out in your head, and the idea of like going to your manager at sprint retrospective and being like, well, manager, I wrote the entire feature you wanted, but because some person I've never met doesn't want to look at it, I'm not done. And honestly, like, just if especially if you're not at like an open source first place, even learning how to have those conversations about setting expectations with working in an open source project stuff.
yeah.
But even then, you still feel terrible. Even if you understand everything that's going on, you want to bring the good stuff to people as quick as you can. And when anything
Mhm.
gets in your way, if you're a professional, you're a person who cares and wants to get that stuff done, that
Yeah.
it is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the time that I put together a PR for a project that simply just no response at all from the maintainers, um, I had a super understanding initial requester inside G Research. But you're right, that could have gone differently. Could have been, we're losing X per hour on this bug, and where's the problem, But I'm sure others will have that experience. I thankfully have not had it yet.
Yeah, and I mean that's something I always like to say kind of close to the end of the show is like it is kind of, nice. I've been working open source a long time. G Research really has enabled us to do a lot of cool stuff with open source, like this podcast, like letting me steal an hour of your valuable time for us to sit here and chit chat about things that have been going on. So, if someone's out there, if you're listening to this and you're looking for work right now, whether it be tech, quant finance, whatever, just go to gresearch.com/vacancies. We'll have that linked in the description and go see what's available in the Dallas, Texas, and London, UK areas. Beautiful offices, great locations, just a good place to be if you want to be in the office. So we always want to thank them for that. And I thank you, Tim, for being here, for being our guest. It's been super interesting talking about the transition from corporate to open source and the NVIDIA hardware stuff, which I'm going to have to go look more into now because that feeds into my pipeline, makes Ironic more popular. But for now, thanks everyone. This is a G Research Open Source Software Outreach podcast. I'm Jay. On behalf of Tim and everyone here, I'd like to say thank you. Have a nice day.